This is a video response which I hope will in some small way shed a little bit of light on what it was like to be a gamer in the early 80s. And I'm sending this out to boltorange, or boltorange, as a reflection on some of the great clips he's been putting out, such as Who Killed Blackleaf and the schizophrenic nature of the old school Renaissance and the 3.5 and all that crap. So basically, I'm just going to reminisce a little bit, and this is not nostalgia, this is just history. When I started, I was 13. It was 1983. It may have been when I was 12 and it was 1982, but anyway, I'm going to say 1983, because a lot of great stuff happened in 1983. And at that time, there were many different versions of the game available. There were many different versions of Dungeons & Dragons available. There were other games too, but if you were a role player at that age, in the part of the world that I come from, what people played was D&D. A lot of small towns, that sort of thing. There's no internet in use by common people yet. And other than the people who introduced me to gaming, the only time I ever saw the game mentioned anywhere was in advertisements in comic books. And there literally, for years, was no way for me to buy the game myself. And my original copies were all used. Okay? So, older kids tried the game, didn't like it, sold it to a used goods and used bookstore in the town where I went to high school. And that's how I got my first copies of the game. I was given my first copy of the basic rules by the people who introduced me to playing. Now, they had multiple box sets, and they had multiple versions of the box set. So if an older brother was running the game, you got an older flavor of the rules. And as beginners just starting out, often there would be overlaps between different rule sets without really anyone being all that aware that this was going on. I can remember hoping to get the red box myself, eventually getting all of, Beckme myself. I wanted the Menser cover, not even having any awareness that what I've been running all the way through, was kind of a mishmash of Holmes and Moldvay and just by what I'd picked up. But what I'm trying to get at is, at that point in time, you had access to people who had started playing with, let's say, Holmes, and some had started playing with Moldvay, and the first edition AD&D was out, which we just called Advanced. So you would go from game to game, and you would meet people who would only play Basic, or people who would play, Basic and Expert and Companion, etc., etc. And as time went on, the division between Basic D&D and Advanced D&D was my first experience of the Edition Wars. And some of the people that I started gaming with, they never moved on to Advanced. And if they're playing today, they're probably still playing Basic, Expert. And I don't remember a lot of love for Companion, to be honest. So they may have just stuck there. I started out, and I went from Basic to Advanced. I added in Basic and Expert as something that I would run. I eventually figured out what all of the the different feels in these two approaches to the game meant and what might be a better fit for the people I could play with. I eventually collected the whole set, finally getting the Immortal box set pretty much around the time that I decided I was only going to play Advanced. But it was nice to have the rules anyway and fiddle with them, try to make them apply to Advanced in some way. And, you know, it was a very experimental time, and that is really the key thing that I remember. I remember it being very important to play by the rules as written. And when you encountered a situation where there was no rule, you would make something up. Otherwise, the game stopped. Right? And if people liked how that rule worked, you kept it. And if they thought it was stupid, well, you heard about it. Or you suddenly noticed that there weren't that many people interested in playing at your table anymore. And when you got a reputation for being fair and having an interesting story, people wanted to game with you. Now, my gaming history starts with getting to play once and then being asked to run the game. So my very second game of Dungeons & Dragons, I was the game master. And before long, I noticed that I was running the game much more often than I was playing the game. And I started to look for ways that I could play. So, I mean, I enjoyed creating adventures, and I enjoyed plotting out my dungeons and that sort of thing. It was all good fun. I liked being on both sides of the screen, but, you know, I'd gotten excited by the idea of playing the game, and there was disparity there in how often I was getting to play. So I very quickly moved into jumping from group to group to play with anybody I could. And part of the reason for this was that I really couldn't have a regular game group easily because my parents at that time didn't think that this was something I should be spending my time on. So it all had to be done in secret. So part of my early teenage rebellion was sneaking out to play Dungeons & Dragons, and I know maybe a lot of people listening to this have that same experience. It wasn't until later that we sorted everything out, and my folks were cool enough to apologize. However, I digress. My point is that as I went from group to group to group, there were different rules everywhere I went. Everyone was having a good time, unless you stumbled across someone who just wasn't equipped to be a good game master, for whatever reason. But people were playing sometimes the same game differently, sometimes different versions of the same game, or, like I described before, you're going from advanced or basic or what have you. So that environment meant, again, that rules as written became very important, because there was a perception that if the way that you ran your game was easier than what the rules allowed, or was perceived to be easier than what other people were doing, that you were some kind of munchkin or power gamer, or you were cheating. It's really what it felt like. People were saying, you're not a good player, you cheat. And as a teenager, this game was fairly important to the people that I played with, and people like to be known for their mastery of their hobby, right? You're really good at doing this, telling a story, or creating a dungeon, or you've got interesting characters, you're a good role player. Nobody wants to be the person that, you know, is gaming the system, you know, or being looked down on for the way that they played. So I would typify this period really as being experimental. I think it's an important thing to remember that a lot of the people that were playing, except maybe those lucky enough to play in large centers where there was much more of an awareness through older gamers and through gaming conventions and that sort of thing, where there's a greater awareness of the progression of the rules from one edition to another edition. I think there was a lot of, let's call it what it is, I think there was a lot of ignorance about the development of the game And it wasn't until much later that people got a sense of how different each edition of BASIC felt, and the different playstyle intended for AD&D compared to BASIC, and how things had evolved, and how the experience of running games for larger and larger and larger and larger demographics of people may have influenced the authors in how they prepared the rules for use. So many more cases would have come up, so many more corner cases, so many more situations and environments would be asked about. How do you do this? You know, and I can remember the friend who introduced me to the game. I remember his older brother looking down on people who asked that question. You know, how do you do this? And I remember him leaving gaming, really, because he got so fed up with the lack of innovation. And most of the conversations I can remember about gaming were designing how we would handle certain situations, and that was fun, you know, and getting those rules in play and seeing how they worked. Not exactly house ruling as it came to be, or seemed to me later, as we moved toward the end of the 80s, and you know, terms like Power Gamer and Munchkin and Monty Hall were by then well established. The pioneering spirit, or make it up, or the GameStop's attitude from my first days in gaming, by the time we get to the end of the 80s, it felt more like house ruling was something you did to fix a broken rule. AD&D pretty much had all the rules that you needed, and more books are being released all the time. And we're still really young and don't have a lot of experience with other game systems, even though more and more were appearing all the time. You know, for most of the people that I met in college, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s, D&D was the only game that people had exposure to, and it was in college that we started to experiment. You know, so 88, 89, 90 is where I started being exposed to games that weren't D&D. And as soon as I got real exposure to other games, to be honest, I dropped D&D like a stone. I went on to other games that served my purposes more. A lot of my friends stuck with D&D and still play it to this day, but it wasn't for me. But what I remember most is how the pioneering spirit turned into, as more books came our way and more rules came our way, turned into a fixing what is broken. And I haven't really seen that attitude go away. I've stayed on the periphery of Dungeons & Dragons play, and have been very active in a lot of other games, and I felt that this attitude of fixing what is broken was imported into Storyteller when Vampire and Werewolf and Mage and Wraith broke. As we went through first edition World of Darkness into second edition and into revised, that we need house rules to fix what is broken attitude remained. And I wonder how much that has infected and affected all the gamers that have grown up with Storyteller being their first experience, or, you know, third edition D&D, and then 3.5 and then 4 editions, which I've never bothered to get involved with. So I think I've rambled enough, and I hope this provides some insight into one gamer's life. I'm speaking as one gamer, not. I've decided not to be responsible for all gamers everywhere my age. Hope this helps.